Hello, everyone. Welcome to AIM343. I'm Tarun Sairam. I'm a senior product manager with the SageMaker inference team. And with me, I have my colleague, Chingwei Li, who's going to be co-presenting. He's a senior AI/ML specialist architect. And with us today, we also have Vivek Govindapillai, who's a senior director of engineering at Here Technologies. And so in this session, we'll start with a typical overview of the ML lifecycle, and then we'll double-click into the model validation and deployment aspects of it, and we'll compare all the existing options that you have for validation and deployment. And once we do that, we'll see how shadow testing fits into the picture, and then followed by how you can do shadow testing with Amazon SageMaker, right? And then I'm going to hand it off to Chingwei here, who's going to do a short demo. And then to wrap up the session, we'll have Vivek come and tell us how Here Technologies is using shadow testing. And we'll wrap up with a quick Q&A at the end. So let's dive straight in. So as we all know, machine learning is a very iterative process, right? So this diagram should be very familiar to you. So if we take a high-level view of this diagram, we can break it down into three phases. Right? First is the model building phase, which consists of the data processing, feature engineering, and model training. And so at the end of the model training step, what you have is a trained model artifact. And from here, we go into the model validation and deployment step. Here, essentially, what you're doing is you're asking yourself two questions, right? In the validation step, you're saying, hey, this new model that I've trained, is it good enough for me to go and deploy it into my production environment? Is it good enough for me to go and replace it with the model I have in production? And if you answer yes to that question, then you get to the deployment step. And in the deployment step, what you're really trying to figure out is, like, hey, I have a model that's in production. How do I swap that model out with the new model that I have trained and validated? And how do I do it in a way that maximizes availability and does not cause any customer impact? Right? How do I minimize customer impact and maximize availability? Right? And then once you have rolled out that model, the job doesn't stop there. And then we enter the third phase, which is the post-deployment phase, where you're comparing the model that you have just launched. You're comparing the performance metrics along with the model quality baselines that you generated during the training step. And you're constantly making the decision of whether or not to re-trigger the whole process all over again. Right? So specifically, let's double-click into the validation and deployment aspects of it. So here, there are three options. The first two are validation options, and the third one is a deployment option. And so let's move from left to right, right? So first, let's start with the validation that you do as a part of the training step. And so the good news is that, since it's a part of the training step, you're probably already doing it. And the data is readily available for you to do the validation and generate a baseline, right? But the one con of this approach might be that the data you're using in training might not be representative of what you have in production, right? So there might be a little bit of a drift. So to counter this, what many of our customers do is what I have in the second column called offline replays. So here, what customers do is they capture their production data, and then they replay it in some form using a tool such as batch transform onto the new model to see how the new model performs. So the advantage of this is you get closer to production data, but the con is depending upon how you're doing it, you might lose some fidelity in terms of operational metrics such as latency. Right? And there's a trade-off between how often you're doing this and cost. So the more often you do it, the closer you get to production data, but you might start incurring costs because of that. And finally, moving on to deployment guardrails, right? So deployment guardrails is a capability of SageMaker inference where to perform model updates. Essentially, SageMaker performs blue-green deployments on your behalf. So SageMaker orchestrates it on your behalf, and it gives you a couple of advanced capabilities, right? So you can really control the granularity in which the traffic gets shifted from the blue fleet to the green fleet, and you can either choose from all-at-once traffic shifting, or you can choose linear or canary traffic shifting modes, and to get from the old model to the new model, right? And another cool feature is the automatic rollbacks. So wherein you can set preset triggers saying that, hey, you can preset alarms saying, hey, if my model latency for the new model goes above a certain limit, I want you to automatically roll back to the previous version of my model, right? Which is really cool, and it helps you contain the blast radius if your new model has like a higher than expected model latency. But on the other hand, the con of this approach is for the customers who get already exposed to this new model, they have to these undesirable characteristics. So there is some potential customer impact there. So here's where shadow testing really fits in, right? So shadow testing is a deployment practice wherein you deploy a shadow model alongside a production model. You mirror the copy of a traffic to the shadow model, and then you're able to compare the performance of the production model and the shadow model together, right? And so here in our previous example, if your model latency kind of is higher in the shadow model, you would see that even during the validation phase. So because of that, you're not going to promote that, and you can proactively prevent customers from having adverse impact, right? So, and some of the cons of shadow models, shadow testing is the fact that, it's pretty complex to implement, right? And so to help, so that's where I'm really excited about the feature that we announced earlier today, where SageMaker now natively supports shadow testing. So before we get to the details of that, let's take a quick recap under the hood of what exists underneath your SageMaker endpoint, right? So within the SageMaker endpoint is a construct called as a production variant. And a production variant consists of three things, right? So you have the ML model, which is the output of your training step. And you have your serving container. And you have a couple of options here. You can either use the first-party framework containers that AWS provides, and it's available for a variety of frameworks, or you can bring your own frameworks, containers here. So if you bring your own containers, all you need to just guarantee is that they map to the container contracts that are published by SageMaker, and you're good to go. And finally, you can for the ML instance, you can choose from an array of CPU, GPU, or accelerated compute instances. So these are the three components that make up the production variant. And auto-scale, you can configure auto-scaling to scale with the granularity of a production variant. So if your production variant receives traffic, you can automatically configure auto-scaling to add instances or when you're or otherwise, right? Now today with this launch, we are adding another construct, which is pretty similar to production variants, called shadow production variants or shadow variants. As you can see, the components are exactly identical to the production variant. So here you can create a shadow variant in your endpoint, and you can have, you can swap any or all components of your production variant. So you can just say, if you just want to test out a new model, you can keep the container and instance the same and just swap out the new model. Or you can change, you can keep the model and container the same and swap out the instance if you're curious to try out a new instance type, right? And what SageMaker does is, on your invocation traffic, it mirrors a portion of the invocation traffic to your shadow variant, and this is completely controlled by you, right? So you can set the traffic to the shadow variant from anywhere from 0% to 100%. So you can, So this helps you control costs. And the response of the shadow variant, again, you can either discard it, or we have enhanced our data capture capability that logs the requests and responses from the production variant to the S3 bucket. So we've enhanced it to incorporate shadow variants as well. So just to recap, so in this, through this feature, SageMaker takes care of the mirroring the requests. So we try to do it in a performance agnostic way. And because of the amount of traffic that you can control to the shadow variant, you can start really small. So this is very helpful, if you have a behemoth of an endpoint with hundreds of instances, and you want to start with a few instances and have 1% of the traffic go to the shadow variant and then slowly dial up from there, right? And then this capability is integrated into the existing SageMaker update endpoint API, right? So if you've built a workflow that leverages the update endpoint API and you're consuming it either through the console API or many of our SDKs, so this should be transparent to you. So all you need to do is to add the new shadow production variant construct to your endpoint configuration and use the update endpoint API to trigger that. So that is how you can leverage the shadow testing capability if you currently use SageMaker inference APIs, right? Now, along with this launch, we did not just stop there, right? So we introduced tools to help you manage the end-to-end lifecycle of shadow tests. And we created this in the console, right? So here the cool step is in addition to what you saw before. So you can create, monitor, and act on the results of shadow tests all from the AWS console. So the cool feature that I really like about this is you can set up the test for a predefined amount of time. So you say, hey, I want to run a shadow test. I want to run it for a week. But after a week, I want you to clean up my shadow variant and restore my endpoint to the state that I started my test at. So you can totally do that so that you don't forget about shadow variants running and incurring costs on your behalf, right? So that's a really cool feature that I like. And then once a test is in progress or it's completed, you can monitor the operational performance through a live dashboard. And just to recap, so whenever you create a SageMaker endpoint, so SageMaker automatically vends certain metrics on your behalf. So these are either invocation metrics. So invocation metrics are things like latency, error rate, or these can be instance metrics such as like CPU, GPU, or disk utilization. So here through this live dashboard, what we've done is essentially we've kind of compared, we present an overlay chart between the metrics of your production variant and your shadow variant, and we kind of give it to you side by side so that you can make the determination of whether the shadow variant is good enough to be promoted to production, right? And once you've made that determination, so you can, through this console experience, you can also trigger the deployment of that through the deployment guardrails feature that we mentioned earlier, right? And just to recap, the key benefits of this feature are like you can leverage existing workflows. You don't have to build additional orchestration. And then we discussed a couple of ways in which you can control costs. One of them being like controlling the traffic sampling, and the other one being like a time duration of tests. And then this shadow testing enables you to proactively validate instead of reactively validation. And then through the dashboard, you can compare the operational performance. And through all of this, you can accelerate your model deployment from weeks to days, right? And just before we head into the demo, I'd like to talk about pricing and availability. So the pricing today with SageMaker inference endpoints, there are 3 pricing dimensions. So you're charged for ML instances, storage, and data processing. So with shadow variants, you still only pay for the infrastructure provision. So you still pay for the ML instances and the storage associated with the shadow variants, but you are not charged for the data processing, right? And then this feature is available in GA where SageMaker inference is available, except for China and US Cloud regions. And this works with real-time endpoints. And here to show us a demo of this feature is Chingwei.
All right. So now let's quickly show you how to set up a shadow test in SageMaker. All right. First, log into your SageMaker console and go to Shadow Test, and then click Create Shadow Test. Enter the shadow test name, and optionally, you can add a description or tags for your shadow test. Now, the next step is to add permission. Right? We need to have an IAM role that has the right permission to allow SageMaker to create the shadow test for us. And I already have a role pre-created. And make sure this role has SageMaker full access permission attached. Now you have 2 workflows to choose from. One is for using existing endpoint. This is to say that you already have endpoint in production that is tied to your application, and you want to create a shadow variant to it. From here, you can see the endpoint will be listed here, and you can easily create a shadow variant right from here. The other workflow is to say that we want to create a new endpoint with both the production variant and the shadow variant. Right? So in this demo, we are going to create a new variant. Enter your variant name. All right. And next, we want to add the production variant and the shadow variant. Just click the button Add. We want to add the production variant first. Here, I choose a model I have trained a couple days ago as my production variant. Then I add the shadow variant. I add a different model that was trained a few days earlier than the production variant model. As you can see, at this point, right, we have the production variant, shadow variant, both created by the default settings. We can reconfigure it as we need it. So by selecting the shadow variant and click Edit, we will be able to reconfigure the shadow variant's instance type and traffic sample percentage. We are going to change the instance type to C5 in this demo and click Apply. Next, we want to change the duration of this shadow test. By default, it lasts for 7 days, but you can change it from anywhere between 1 hour to 30 days. And optionally, you can turn on the data capture option. So that gives SageMaker the option, right, to capture both the prediction request data and the response data from both variants for your further investigation. We are going to leave this as unchecked in this demo, and then create a shadow test, and that's it. Right? After clicking this button, a shadow test will last, it takes about 5 to 10 minutes to create. As you can see from the SageMaker console, right, our test is being created. You can also see the list of existing shadow tests that has been created at prior time. So next, I want to show you, let's say we have existing shadow test. How can we view and monitor the progress of it? I go to the same console at SageMaker shadow test, select the one of interest, and click View on the drop-down list of actions. So the first thing we see is the summary. You can see this shadow test is currently running, and we can monitor the progress, right? And the next panel is the metrics panel. From here, from the drop-down list, you can select all the supported operational metrics, such as latency, right? And the SageMaker will present the summary statistics for the production and shadow variant in this panel. If you want to dive a little deeper into that, right, you can also come down to the analysis panel. So here, this is a dashboard that SageMaker creates to visualize all the metrics that we just mentioned about, such as number of invocations, model latencies, etc., and also the instances, CPU utilization, memory utilization. You can change the time scale from 1 hour to 1 week. You can also choose different aggregation functions. So in this demo, you can see the production variant and the latency is significantly higher than the shadow variant. So that gives us evidence to deploy the shadow variant into production. Well, to do so, right, we can scroll down to the environment section, right, which gives you the summary of your variant, the model, the instance type, and instance count at this panel. Right? To deploy the shadow variant, we just need to click the Deploy Shadow Variant button. And here, we have different options. Right? We can retain the settings for the existing production variant, that is retaining the production variants, the instance type, and instance count. But it's recommended to retain the shadow variant setting because it's obvious that our testing is done on the variant, according the variant setting, right? So make sure if you have auto-scaling set up for your production variant, make sure you set it up for the shadow variant as well. And it's also recommended to have 100% of your traffic routed to the shadow variant during testing before you deploy it into production. Let's confirm. We want to deploy, and then click Deploy Shadow Variant. And that's it. That will also complete this shadow test. Right? As you can see, the status is changing from running to stopping. Right? At the same time, right, you notice that by default, every shadow test we set up is going to complete according to the schedule, but we can complete it early if we feel we have enough data to complete the shadow variant. To do so, right, we select the shadow variant, shadow test, and click Actions. Right, so here we have two options. We can either deploy the shadow variant into production, and what happens here is the shadow variant will become production variant, and the previous production variant will be deleted and removed. Or if our shadow variant tells us that the performance is not as good as the production variant, we can just say, well, no, I want to remove the shadow variant, and then you are no longer charged. The production variant will stay, and the shadow variant will be deleted. And click Confirm, and that's the end of the demo. Thank you, and now I will hand it over to Vivek.
A quick word about us. We are one of a handful of companies that maps the world digitally, right? Many of you, of course, use maps on your phone for things like getting from A to B. But if you have used maps for anything other than navigation, like on the phone, let's say in your car or as part of your work, there's a very good chance you have used one of our maps. In fact, many of the large businesses in the world use digital maps and location services from HERE technologies. Businesses rely on up-to-date and accurate maps. And we update our maps millions of times a day with the help of machine learning. Now, where do you see or experience us? Right? Our capabilities are aiding awareness for 170 million plus vehicles on the road. We are helping our customers by predicting traffic and ETAs. And some of our customers have their own data, location data, right? We enable them to create private maps for logistics. Now, why are we here today, right? We have been using machine learning for many years, but we were not using the SageMaker. We only started using SageMaker recently. We liked what we saw. We liked it so much, we are rolling it out to our location platform customers. And the feature that we are talking about today, the shadow testing, is creating quite an interest in our company. And I'll tell you why. Many of our capabilities, for example, like predictions about congestion and routing based on that, is used by critical services in real world, like ambulances, fire force, police. When we roll out a modified model, it is critical for us to make sure the performance of it is equal to or better than what we already have in production. We cannot afford to have 1 in 20 ambulances show up 2 minutes late, or maybe 1 in 50 fire trucks take a route that is a little bit more slower. So we have to absolutely make sure our models are up to par before we roll it out into production. Now, to enable the SageMaker for our customers, what we have done is integrate the SageMaker into the HERE workspace. Now, the HERE workspace brings together a suite of tools to solve location-centric problems. It includes a workflow editor that's a low-code, extensible environment. It is integrated with our map validation and editing tools. And all of this is built on top of our location platform that gives access to location services, dynamic and historic location data, and maps. And there are 3 main reasons customers bring their location data to our workspace. Some of them want to transform their raw spatial data to maps and gain insights from it. Others want to go a step further and create dynamic optimized maps for their own use cases. And yet, others want to go even further and customize location services to use their own private maps. And in each of these journeys, these workspace users can use the SageMaker and all its capabilities. Now, let me walk you through the implementation where we have used the SageMaker and the shadow testing capabilities. In a nutshell, what this is doing is like reading the real-time traffic feed of incidents and trying to predict the delay caused by that in a particular road segment, right? There are two main sources of data to train the model here. One is the trillions of historical data points of incidents that we already have. And the next one is like, the data we collect about the road segments. So each of the road segment that we map, we have like a lot of data about it, right? What kind of road it is, number of lanes, the speed limit, the slope, all that data is used for training this model. And here you see an extension node that will invoke the SageMaker Studio and pass along some of this configuration data that would allow it to read this, the here reference data. Now the third data source that we have is our real-time traffic feed. And we process you can see like 311 million miles of real-time vehicle probe and sensor data every hour into a traffic feed. And our stream pipeline is listening to this traffic feed. Whenever it detects a incident, for us an incident is like a broken down car on the side of the road, lane closures, an accident, right? It is using this trained model to predict the delay that would be caused by that incident, right? So this is the architecture of our implementation. It's a little bit too busy, so I'll try to highlight a few things there. On the lower swim lane, you'll see the here Python SDK. This enables us to read our data catalogs from inside the SageMaker Studio, right? The other part that I want to highlight is towards the right side of this slide, you'll see the transform, map match, those pieces. So the prediction that is coming out of that pipeline is used by these downstream processes to update our here map content. And that is in turn used by our routing services and search services, and the real customers would see that, right? The last thing that I want to highlight is you don't see the shadow testing, any of that in this diagram. That is because it's completely transparent to our process that is running in production, right? There's no impact on it. Now here, that model predicts the traffic delay, right? And on the video on the left side, you can see in Los Angeles, it is processing some of the incidents, and it's marking the delays. And the light-colored pins show less delay or predicted delay, and the dark red pins show a much higher delay on that, right? And the graph on the right side is showing the latency of the production and shadow models in microseconds, right? The y-axis there with no label is actually the latency in microseconds. All right? So that kind of brings me to the end of the implementation we had. So my question to you is do you have business problems that would benefit from location intelligence and machine learning? If you do, remember we have location services and data, both dynamic, historic, and details about the road network, as well as an easy integration into SageMaker and all its capabilities. We have found the shadow testing capability to be very useful for us in the situations that we encounter. It has also enabled us to be a bit more adventurous and bolder in our changes in the model, because it does not affect our production customers. And if you have use cases where the predictions are critical, right, you will also find this to be really useful. That brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'll open for questions.